The night was warm and silent. Above the dark lagoon, the moon hung low and round, casting a silver shimmer across the slow-moving waves. Palm leaves whispered softly in the sea breeze, like an ancient lullaby that had drifted through centuries, unchanged. Somewhere on the island, a drum tapped once, twice, then fell quiet again. It was a night much like this, long ago in the Middle Ages, when a young Maldivian bride would stand beneath the moon, wrapped in silk, her heart trembling. She did not speak. Brides did not speak on nights like this. Their words were not meant for the air. They were buried beneath their breath, sealed behind closed lips. The village, though resting, was never truly asleep. People were listening, always listening. The night of a wedding was not just for the bride and groom. It belonged to everyone. It was a story the whole island would tell tomorrow, or whisper about for years. A lantern swayed on a bamboo pole outside a coral stone house. Muffled footsteps passed on the sand, soft as moth wings. A priest whispered a prayer, low and rhythmic. A grandmother stirred coconut oil over a slow flame, its scent floating out into the night. And inside a room, somewhere behind a curtain of woven palm, a young woman waited. She was no queen, no noblewoman. She was simply a daughter of the island, just like so many who came before her and after her. But tonight, everything in her world was about to change. Her fingers clutched at the embroidered fabric of her wedding dress. She could still feel the cool of the water from the cleansing bath she'd been given earlier. She could smell the faint trace of crushed flowers rubbed into her hair. She had been painted, perfumed, and prepared, not for herself, but for him. No one had asked her if she was ready. No one ever did. Far away, the ocean sighed against the reef. Its rhythm was eternal, older than kings, older than palaces. It had carried fishermen and merchants and whispers of distant lands. It had seen brides like her, night after night, for centuries. On this island, in the Maldives of the Middle Ages, a bride's wedding night was not a private story. It was a ritual, a duty, a weight placed gently but firmly on young shoulders. The world had decided what would happen to her long before she learned what the word marriage even meant. And so she waited. The curtain at the doorway stirred with the wind. A shadow moved outside, then paused. The bride held her breath. She could hear laughter from the courtyard, the sharp rhythm of men's voices. She could hear a distant drum tapping again, slow, steady, like a heartbeat that did not belong to her. Her mother had told her days ago in the quietest corner of their kitchen, "Do not speak. Do not look away. Do not cry. This is how it has always been." Those were the last instructions she would receive as someone's daughter. Soon, she would belong to someone else. In the Maldives of centuries past, the wedding night was wrapped in ritual and expectation. There were no locks on doors, no space for hesitation. A girl became a bride, and a bride became a wife. The island expected proof, not of love, but of purity. And that proof would be whispered about by sunrise. The bride shivered as a gust of wind slipped through the woven wall. Outside, the village torches flickered against the night. Inside, her candle burned low, throwing soft, trembling light against the plastered wall. She traced her fingers over the floor mat, feeling the pattern of the weave beneath her nails. Anything to steady the rhythm of her breath. Once, when she was younger, She had listened to older girls telling ghost stories about this very night. Spirits, they said, lingered near the bridal house. Some whispered that a bride's fear could call a demon. Others said the ocean itself would rise if she disobeyed her duty. Of course, these were stories, but stories had power. Every bride carried them into the night like invisible chains. Somewhere beyond the lagoon, a conch shell was blown, a low, hollow sound that vibrated through the sand and the bones. It marked the hour. The groom would come soon. She knew it. Everyone did. She closed her eyes. The stories of the island were not written in books. They lived in the tide, in the mouths of grandmothers, in the eyes of women who never told their own stories out loud. It was a silence as vast as the ocean. And tonight, she was stepping into that silence. When the footsteps finally approached the door, she did not flinch. The curtain lifted. A figure entered. She lowered her gaze. Her heart beat in her throat, but her hands stayed folded in her lap. The wedding night had begun, and with it began a story, not just of one bride, but of thousands, across centuries. A story of power and fear, of rituals and shadows, of whispered expectations and forgotten voices. A story the ocean still remembers. The Maldives, a chain of emerald islands scattered like pearls across the blue skin of the Indian Ocean. When you close your eyes and let the sea breeze brush against your face, you can almost feel it, the softness of the sand, the salt on your lips, and the endless hum of the waves. But centuries ago, in the heart of the Middle Ages, these islands were not only a place of beauty. They were a world ruled by quiet traditions and unspoken rules. Long before the world knew the Maldives as a destination of sunlight and luxury, these islands lived in silence and shadows. Each atoll was its own little universe. A few palm trees, small houses of coral stone, fishing boats pulled up on the sand. No engines, no electricity. Just the sound of the wind and the tide, night after night. In those days, the islands were ruled by sultans. Power did not rest in the hands of the people. It lived in palaces built from limestone and coral, in the hearts of men whose words were law. But the islands were also shaped by something far older than any ruler: tradition. The Maldives converted to Islam in the year 1153. With that came a new way of life, new prayers, new expectations, new rituals. But beneath these, the older customs of the islands still lingered, a blend of faith and folklore, of old beliefs tied to the moon and the sea. In every shadow, a story. In every ritual, a trace of something ancient. Marriages in those days were not about romance. Love was not the language of weddings. Duty was. Honor was. A girl's future was rarely her own to choose. Alliances between families, power between clans, reputation in the village, these decided who she would marry and when. The Maldives were small islands, close-knit. Everyone knew each other. Secrets rarely stayed hidden, especially when it came to weddings. A bride's marriage was not only a private moment, it was a community event. A knot tied not just between two people, but between families, neighbors, sometimes entire atolls. Fishermen would haul in their nets at sunset. Children would follow them along the shore. Elders would gather in the courtyards, speaking in low voices about the upcoming wedding, who the groom was, how much he owned, how the families stood in the village. A bride's name was whispered long before her wedding day came. On some islands, a bride could be as young as 12 or 13 years, sometimes younger. Her childhood would end with the tying of a knot.
And once that knot was tied, her fate was sealed. The islands were isolated, surrounded by water, far from great empires. But stories from travelers, merchants from Arabia, sailors from India, explorers from distant kingdoms drifted ashore. They spoke of these islands as places of beauty, and as places where tradition ruled with a quiet, heavy hand. The groom was often older, a man of wealth or power or family standing. He did not always know the bride before the ceremony. She often did not know him either. The union was decided for them, and the sea carried no protest. Every wedding was wrapped in ritual. From the moment the sun rose, preparations would begin. Families hung palm garlands over doors. Coconut oil burned slowly in clay lamps. The island smelled of flowers, sea breeze, and warm sand. Drums echoed softly through the evening air. And yet, beneath the music and feasting, everyone knew the weight of the night that followed. Because in the Maldives of the Middle Ages, marriage was not simply about the living. It was a continuation of the past. The old customs were like coral, buried deep, unmovable, shaping everything built upon them. The sultans and noble families followed more elaborate customs. Their weddings stretched over several nights. The royal bride was dressed in silk imported from faraway lands, embroidered with gold thread, perfumed with rare oils. But even beneath the golden cloth, she was bound by the same silence as the poorest fisherman's daughter, because tradition did not bend for silk. When darkness fell, the islands grew quiet. Only the sea spoke. Torches lined the sand, and behind woven palm doors, something older than the ceremony itself would unfold, the ritual of the wedding night. The islands believed in purity. They believed a woman carried not only her body into marriage, but the honor of her entire family. And this belief was not a gentle one. It was strict, unforgiving. On small islands, where everyone knew everyone, a whisper could ruin a life. It was a world where a woman could not choose, where the tide carried her forward, whether she was ready or not. But it was also a world alive with stories. Folklore of the sea, whispers of spirits who walked the shore on wedding nights, legends of brides who cried beneath the moonlight and were carried away by the waves. Legends that grew and twisted through generations, never written down, only spoken softly in the dark. The Maldives in the Middle Ages was a quiet world, a beautiful world, and a dangerous one for those born as daughters. The sound of waves that lull modern travelers to sleep once lulled countless brides into nights they never chose. And now, centuries later, their stories drift back to us like shells washed up on the sand, faint, fragile, but still here, still whispering. Before the wedding night, before the silk dress, the drums, and the soft tapping of feet on sand, there was a lifetime of quiet shaping. A Maldivian girl did not become a bride in one night. She was molded for it, from the moment she could walk. The islands of the Maldives in the Middle Ages were gentle to the eye, but unbending to those who lived under their rules. A girl's world was small, her family's house, the courtyard, the well where water was drawn, the beach where mothers washed clothes as the tide crept in. The sky was open, the sea was endless, but for her, the path was narrow. A daughter learned early what her life would become. She watched her mother rise before dawn, wrapping her hair with coconut oil, preparing food, keeping the house. She learned to lower her eyes when elders spoke, to smile without question, to work without pause. By the time she was 5 or 6 years old, she knew the words she was allowed to speak, and the ones she must keep inside. In medieval Maldives, a woman's worth was tied to her obedience, her silence, and her purity. Families taught their daughters to walk softly, speak gently, and listen always. A girl's laughter could be considered too loud, her gaze too bold, her opinion too heavy. It was not cruelty, they would say. It was custom. It was the way things have always been. The sea around the islands shaped everything: the tides, the seasons, even the expectations of women. When men went out to fish, it was the women who waited, who prepared, who kept the small world of the home breathing. They wove mats from palm leaves, cooked rice, dried fish, cared for children. Their hands held the rhythm of daily life, though their names rarely appeared in the songs or stories of the time. Marriage was not a dream. It was a destination, a certainty. A girl's childhood ended the moment someone decided she was ready or useful to join another family. Sometimes she was chosen at 12, sometimes even earlier. It did not matter if she was ready. It only mattered that the time had come. In a world without written contracts, marriage was an exchange of trust, reputation, and honor. For men, it could mean alliances. For women, it meant surrendering to a new household and new expectations. She was no longer her father's daughter. She became someone's wife. If she was lucky, her groom might be close to her age, kind, gentle. If not, he could be much older, a man of wealth or power, a man she barely knew. The women of the islands were expected to bear this fate with grace, to lower their heads and step quietly into a future built by someone else's hands. A girl who resisted could bring shame upon her entire family. And shame lingered like the smell of salt in the air. It did not wash away easily. But within the silence there were whispers. Mothers whispered to daughters in the darkness, not of rebellion, but of survival. How to keep your head low, how to endure, how to keep a part of yourself hidden where no one could take it. Women lived under the gaze of the island. Every movement was seen, every mistake remembered. Virginity was not just personal, it was public. A woman who did not meet the expectation of purity could lose everything: her reputation, her home, even her safety. Even the ocean itself seemed to carry the weight of these expectations. Waves crashed against the shore, night after night, as if reminding every girl, your life belongs not to you, but to the tide. But not all was darkness. Within the quiet corners of the village, women built small worlds of their own. They gathered beneath trees to weave, to share stories, to laugh softly. They learned from each other how to live within the rules without losing the warmth in their hearts. Their power was not loud. It was hidden like embers under ash. Some women became midwives, some healers, some keepers of old island songs. Though their names were rarely written in any history, their hands carried knowledge older than the sultans themselves. They were the invisible threads that held the community together. Still, their fates were tied to men, to fathers, to brothers, to husbands. A girl was born under her father's roof. she was given away under the moon, and on her wedding night she crossed a line she could never return from. This was the world the Maldivian bride grew up in, a world of soft footsteps, lowered eyes, and invisible expectations. And so, when the wedding night arrived, when the drum beats began, when the oil lamps burned, she did not step into that room as a stranger to the weight she carried. She had felt it her entire life.
They could not say. Dreams they could not follow. Prayers they whispered to the ocean, because the ocean never spoke back. Some accepted their fate like the tide. Some hid their fear like pearls in a shell. But all of them walked the same narrow path. And beneath the moonlight, when a bride sat on the woven mat waiting for her groom, she was not just a young woman in silk. She was the sum of every expectation that had been wrapped around her since birth. She was the echo of centuries of women before her. The wedding day in the Maldives began not with noise, but with the sound of water. Before the sun rose, before the drums spoke, before the lanterns were lit, the bride would be led to a quiet place to bathe. Water was more than water on such a morning. It was the island's oldest witness. It had washed away the childhood of countless brides before her. The ocean was near, always near. The tide moved like a heartbeat against the sand. In that soft, gray hour between night and dawn, women gathered around the bride, mothers, aunts, sisters, cousins, each carrying bowls of cool water, fragrant with crushed flowers and coconut oil. The water touched her skin gently, but its meaning was not gentle. It was a cleansing, a transformation, a way of saying who you were before this day is gone. They combed her hair with wooden combs, rubbed her hands with sandalwood paste, and traced oil along her arms until her skin shone softly in the half-light. Not a word was spoken. Only the ocean spoke, and the breeze, and the soft rhythm of hands preparing her for the night that would come. By the time the sun rose, the island was already alive. Wedding days were not private. They were a spectacle. Neighbors swept the pathways. Coconut leaves were woven into garlands and hung like green ribbons between doorways. The smell of cooked rice drifted through the air. Children peeked shyly from corners, whispering about the bride they were not yet old enough to become. The ceremony itself was a tapestry of old customs, some born from the islands, some carried by travelers from distant shores. The Maldives, resting on the sea's great trade routes, was touched by merchants and pilgrims. Over time, their customs blended with local traditions, like shells woven into a mat. There would be prayers spoken by the village elder or the local religious leader. The groom would arrive surrounded by men, cousins, uncles, brothers. The bride would be hidden behind a curtain, waiting, her pulse slow and heavy like the tide before a storm. She was dressed in the finest garments her family could afford. For noble families, this meant imported silk, shimmering golds and deep reds. For fishing families, perhaps hand-woven cotton dyed with island flowers. But no matter the fabric, the symbolism was the same. Her clothing was a veil between the girl she was and the wife she was about to become. Jewelry, too, was more than decoration. Gold bangles and earrings, strings of coral beads, sometimes even coins woven into her hair. Every piece was a promise of dowry, of status, of family pride. They did not belong to her. They belonged to the story being told about her. Outside, men prepared the feast. Fire cracked beneath iron pots, fish stewed in coconut milk, sweet rice cooked slowly, the air filled with the thick, warm scent of celebration. And yet beneath the sounds of festivity, everyone knew the wedding was only half finished. The true ceremony would unfold after the feasting was done, after the torches burned low. Before that, however, came the exchange of blessings. Women circled the bride, whispering short prayers, brushing her forehead with flower petals, tying threads around her wrists for protection. Some whispered verses. Others, older still, whispered something else. Fragments of island folklore, protective charms against spirits said to wander the island on wedding nights. The Maldives in those days was a place where faith and superstition lived side by side. The wedding ceremony was wrapped in religion, but beneath it were layers of older stories, as old as the islands themselves. When the sun finally began to slide into the horizon, painting the lagoon with gold, the bride was escorted to the bridal house. Sometimes it was the groom's home, sometimes a temporary house built near the shore. It was simple: woven palm walls, coral floors, a mat in the center, a single oil lamp flickering. The world outside grew quieter as night approached. The feast died down. The guests drifted away in clusters, whispering, waiting, for they knew what was expected next. Inside, the bride sat on the woven mat, wrapped in heavy fabric and expectation. The rituals were over. The silence had begun. In some parts of the islands, the groom was not allowed to see the bride's face until this moment. In others, they had exchanged only a few short words before the ceremony. This was not a union built on romance. It was built on lineage, on family, on the continuation of a story written long before either of them were born. The community had feasted, sung songs, tapped drums, but the island still waited for the proof. The ceremony was not complete until the marriage was consummated. This belief, passed down like the tide, was an unspoken law. The night itself became part of the ritual. The curtain between the public and the private was paper thin, and the bride, she could feel the entire island breathing outside her door. The oil lamp burned lower. A conch shell sounded in the distance. And then, footsteps. The wedding night had arrived. And with it came centuries of expectation, wrapped in silence and ritual. The day before the wedding did not feel like a celebration. It felt like standing at the edge of a tide that would not turn back. For a Moldavian bride in the Middle Ages, this was the day when time seemed to move differently, softer, slower, as if even the ocean understood that something was about to change. The morning began quietly. No music yet, no laughter, only the steady breath of the sea. A light wind moved through the palm trees, carrying with it the smell of salt and flowers. In a corner of the house, the bride sat cross-legged on a woven mat, her hands folded in her lap. She listened to the waves and tried not to listen to the world inside her. This day belonged to no one but her, And yet even this day was not truly hers. Women moved softly around her. Her mother's hands were busy, folding fabric, polishing the small brass lamp that would burn in the bridal house. Aunts whispered to one another, their voices soft as sea foam. Someone was pounding coconut shells outside. Life continued, but around her it felt as though the world had narrowed to the space between her heartbeat and the ocean. There were no speeches, no goodbyes. In this world, everyone already knew what came next. She had grown up watching other brides take this path. She had seen them dressed in silk, led down the sandy path, their faces lowered, their future fixed like stars in a sky no one dared to touch. She never imagined it would feel like this, like standing on a bridge of woven palm leaves, fragile beneath her bare feet. Tradition said a bride must not cry on her final day. Tears were seen as weakness, as defiance against the order of things. But the ocean did not listen to tradition.
Sometimes, when no one was looking, a bride would walk to the water's edge. There, where the sand met the tide, she would let the waves wash over her feet and whisper everything she could not say to another soul. The sea was the only one who would not tell. Perhaps she whispered her fears. Perhaps she said nothing at all. On this day, she was still a daughter. For a few more hours, she belonged to her father's house, to her mother's cooking, to the smell of drying fish and burning coconut husks. Her room still carried her scent. Her woven mat still held the imprints of her childhood. But every breath she took brought her closer to the moment when all of it would be left behind. When the sun climbed higher, preparations began again. Garlands of fresh flowers were strung across doorways. Women polished the brass vessels that would hold oil for the ceremony. Drummers tested their hands, letting short bursts of rhythm roll into the air like the distant sound of thunder. The bride watched it all quietly. Her body was wrapped in expectation, her mind wrapped in silence. She was not allowed to roam freely. She was told to sit still, to keep her spirit calm, to be ready. Readiness did not mean understanding. It meant surrender. Sometimes, older women, brides long since married, would come to sit beside her. They spoke softly, their voices lined with things they could not say out loud. Be patient, one might murmur. Keep your eyes lowered, another might add. And then, the softest, almost a breath. You will endure. Their words were not meant to frighten, they were meant to prepare, because every woman on the island knew the weight of the night that followed. As the sun began to fall, the light softened. Shadows stretched long across the sand. Birds grew quieter. This was the hour when the island seemed to hold its breath. The bride's hair was oiled and combed again. Fragrant smoke from burning leaves curled upward into the dusk. The final touches were made, not to celebrate her freedom, but to dress her for its end. She looked around the house once more, the clay lamps, the mats she had woven as a girl, the sound of her mother's bracelets clinking as she worked, all the little pieces of a world she would no longer belong to after tonight. In the Maldives of that time, a bride was not taken far, sometimes only a few steps down a sandy path. But the distance she crossed was not measured in steps, it was measured in what she left behind. When the evening drum echoed across the atoll, it was a sound everyone understood. Guests began to gather. The groom's family arrived with baskets of food and small gifts. The air filled with quiet excitement. For them, this was a celebration. For her, it was the last sunset as someone's daughter. As the stars began to appear one by one, the bride sat beneath the flickering light of a small oil lamp. The soft darkness touched her face like a hand she could not hold on to. This was the last time she would sit here as herself. In the soft darkness, a grandmother's voice rose in a low, trembling song, an old wedding lullaby sung for generations. The words spoke not of love, but of inevitability, of how the tide carries everything away eventually.
And so the bride listened. She closed her eyes, and she let the tide carry the last whispers of her childhood into the night. The night came not like a storm, but like a tide, quiet, certain, unstoppable. Across the small island, lamps were being lit, small clay flames flickering against the darkness. The sea was calm, the stars wide and endless. On the sand, footprints of the day were still visible, as if the island itself had not yet decided to forget what had happened in the daylight. For the bride, this night was no longer a distant story whispered by other women. It was here, and it had her name written in silence. The wedding night in medieval Maldives was a night wrapped in ritual. It was called sacred by some, whispered about by others, and feared quietly by most young brides. Every gesture, every sound, every flicker of light had meaning. The women of her family led her down a narrow, sandy path. The air was thick with the scent of burning coconut husks and crushed flowers. Around them, people spoke softly, never loudly, never laughing. A wedding night was not a night of wild festivity. It was a night the island held in solemn breath. The bridal house stood near the shore, a small wooden structure carefully prepared for this single night. Its floor had been swept smooth. Lamps hung in the corners, their light swaying gently with the sea breeze. A low bed made of woven palm and cloth stood in the center. A brass vessel of scented water glimmered in the dim light. This was not a space for celebration. It was a stage. The bride was guided inside and left alone for a moment. Outside, drums beat slowly, not the loud, joyous rhythm of weddings elsewhere, but heartbeat rhythm, a sound that seemed to remind her, this is the moment from which there is no turning back. She could hear the waves only a few meters away. They whispered steadily, as if counting her breaths. She sat still. Her silk garment rustled softly against the woven mat. Her hair was still slick with oil, her wrists heavy with bangles that chimed softly whenever she moved. In the flickering lamplight, the shadows on the walls seemed to breathe with her. Soon, the door creaked. It wasn't a grand entrance. No one announced the groom. He simply came in. He too was wrapped in tradition, dressed in silk, his hair oiled, his expression carefully arranged to show neither joy nor hesitation. In their world, a wedding night was not about love. It was about duty, reputation, and custom. A union arranged, sealed, and witnessed not by hearts, but by expectations. The air between them grew heavy, not with romance, but with everything neither of them could say. Outside, the island waited. Families sat in quiet groups. Older women hummed old songs. Men spoke in low voices. No one intruded. No one asked questions. But everyone knew that this night would decide the bride's place in the world from tomorrow onward. For a bride, this night was not merely a private moment. It was a test she had not chosen. A night where she was expected to surrender, not speak. She lowered her eyes, as she had been taught. She folded her hands in her lap. She did not look at the groom directly, not yet, because custom demanded that the bride remain still, soft, silent. It was said that a good bride moved like the sea at night, quiet, deep, and without a ripple. The groom's footsteps on the wooden floor were slow. He approached her, but tradition placed an invisible wall between them. Before touching her, he had to perform a ritual, the offering of water. He lifted the small brass vessel and held it between them. He poured a few drops into her cupped hands. It wasn't for thirst. It was a symbolic act, the first gesture of the union. She drank, because refusing was unthinkable. And with that simple sip of water, she silently crossed into a new life. The rest happened in the quiet, behind closed walls. But the fear, the uncertainty, the sense of inevitability, these were no secrets. Every woman on the island had felt them once. The night was not hers. The choices were not hers. And yet this night would define how she would be spoken about for years to come. Outside, The drumbeat faded into silence.
The island returned to the hush of the waves and crickets. The stars kept their cold watch. Inside the small house, the light flickered lower, lower, as if the flame itself bowed to the weight of tradition. In some homes, there was tenderness. In others, cruelty. In most, there was simply silence. The kind of silence that leaves no mark on the sand, but lingers in memory. As the night went on, the bride learned the lesson that every woman before her had learned, that marriage in her world began not with words of love, but with surrender to something older and larger than herself. And outside, at the water's edge, the tide rolled in and out, indifferent, eternal, and patient. It had watched hundreds of brides pass through this same night. It would watch hundreds more. The island was not silent that night. It only pretended to be. The waves moved with their slow, endless rhythm. The coconut palms swayed lightly in the breeze. Crickets sang in the darkness, filling the spaces between breaths. But beneath those ordinary sounds, there was something else. A quiet listening. Every wedding night, the island itself became a silent witness. It had watched many brides before her. It had seen the same soft lamplight glowing from the same small wooden houses. It had felt the same footsteps in the sand, the same tremor of hesitation as the bride walked toward a life she had not chosen. The island remembered. It remembered the way the wind carried the scent of crushed flowers every time a wedding was held. It remembered the low drum beats, the shy footsteps, the careful hands of mothers adjusting veils and silks. But most of all, it remembered the silence that followed. The ocean was the first to whisper. It lapped gently at the shore, as though murmuring to the palms, "Another bride walks the path tonight." The palm trees creaked softly in reply, their leaves brushing against each other, like old voices agreeing, "Yes, another one." Above them, the stars watched too. They had looked down on this small island for hundreds of years. They had seen the first union of the first bride and groom long before the world beyond the atoll even knew this place existed. The stars never intervened. They only kept their cold, distant vigil. To the people, this night was about ritual. To the island, it was about memory. When the drums faded and the houses grew quiet, the island's whisper grew louder, not in sound, but in feeling. A soft weight in the air, a hush that reached even the distant reef. The tide slowed, the night deepened. Inside the small wooden bridal house, two young lives were being bound by a tradition that was older than their own names. But outside, the island carried the story like it always did, gently, without judgment. It had whispered for brides who were frightened. It had whispered for brides who cried silently. It had whispered for brides who never spoke their truth to anyone but the night. Sometimes, a grandmother sitting near the door would feel that whisper. She'd pause her humming and stare at the stars. A soft shiver would run through her, not of fear, but of recognition. She too had walked the same path once. She too had sat under that flickering lamp. The island was not cruel. It simply remembered everything. A bird cried out somewhere near the reef, a short, sharp sound that vanished into the wind. In old times, that sound was said to be the spirits of the island calling the bride's name, not to frighten her, but to remind her, "You are not the first. You will not be the last." There was comfort in that, and a sadness too. Not far from the bridal house, the path the bride had walked earlier was already fading. The sand had begun to smooth itself out again, as if the night were gently erasing her footprints. Soon, there would be no sign that a young woman had stood here, her heart trembling like the flame of an oil lamp. The island had seen this before. It would see it again. Somewhere in the shadows, an old woman sitting by the shore whispered a prayer into her hands. Not a loud one, not the kind that reaches the heavens. A small, quiet prayer meant only for the sea to hear. She prayed that the girl inside that house would be treated gently tonight. She had prayed this same prayer for many brides before. And the sea listened. It always did. A breeze carried the sound of distant waves through the palms and down the sandy paths. It curled around the house like a gentle hand, not to protect, not to change anything, but to be present. For in this world, no one spoke of the fear aloud, but the island did. It whispered it through the rustling leaves. It carried it through the shifting sand. It let it rest in the soft spaces between the stars. Inside the house, the oil lamp still flickered. The flame bent with every small gust, as though bowing to the weight of something unseen. The bride and the groom existed in their small circle of tradition. Outside, the entire island stood quietly, holding its breath. If one listened carefully enough, beyond the waves, beyond the night insects, one could almost hear it. A low, steady sound, like the earth itself exhaling. The unseen witness, the silent storyteller, the island itself. When morning would come, people would speak of the wedding night as if it were only a ritual, an event, a tradition completed. But the island would carry what no one else would speak of. The fear in her chest, the heaviness of the groom's footsteps, the hush that fell over everything when the door closed. The island did not forget. It never had. And as the night deepened, it whispered softly to the bride through the palm leaves brushing against the roof. The tide will rise and fall, the stars will fade, but this night, like all the others, will live in memory. Not just yours, but mine too. Dawn came softly. It did not knock. It simply unfolded. The first light slipped across the lagoon like a silk ribbon, touching the tips of the palms, then the rooftops, then the narrow sandy path where her footprints had vanished overnight. The drums were silent now. The night had passed, and with it, something within the young bride had shifted forever. Morning on the island was never loud, but this morning carried a particular stillness, the kind that follows an unspoken story. Inside the small wooden house, the oil lamp had burned out hours ago. A faint curl of smoke lingered in the corner, clinging to the beams like a secret. The bride sat alone now, wrapped in a white cloth, her hair still heavy with the scent of oil and salt. Her eyes stared at nothing, fixed somewhere between the past and the unknown. In her world, this morning was not her own. It belonged to the island, to the families waiting outside, to the whispers that would soon begin. Somewhere beyond the house, women were already awake. The sound of pestles pounding coconuts echoed softly across the village. Someone was lighting a cooking fire. Someone was washing dishes in a wooden basin. Life resumed, indifferent to the quiet storm that had passed through the bride's world in the night. For the bride, this morning was the beginning of a different life. She had crossed the invisible line between girl and wife. She had no say in when, no say in how.
A soft knock came at the door. It was not the groom. It was the women of her family. Her mother, her aunts, a few elderly neighbors. They entered, not with questions, but with practiced silence. They had all once sat where she now sat. They didn't need to ask what she felt. They already knew. One of them knelt beside her, adjusted the cloth around her shoulders, and whispered the same words that had been whispered for generations. Do not speak of the night. What happens here stays here. The bride nodded, not out of agreement, but because this was what every bride did. Silence was not just expected, it was demanded. In this world, her voice belonged to the wind, not to the people. The older women began their morning ritual, washing her hands, combing her hair, rewrapping the silk. Their movements were gentle, but their faces carried the weight of stories buried long ago. They did not ask if she was all right. No one ever did. Outside, the sun slowly climbed higher. The men of the village gathered under a shaded tree, speaking in low voices. A few of them laughed, a sound sharp and careless. To them, the wedding was already behind them, a completed tradition. To the bride, it was still breathing inside her, like a shadow. The groom was nowhere in sight. Tradition allowed him to come and go as he pleased, but the bride had no such freedom. She was expected to stay quiet, modest, composed. Even if her world had cracked a little in the dark, she was to smile like the sea on a windless day. In medieval Maldives, what happened on a wedding night was rarely spoken of openly. It was wrapped in layers of ritual, secrecy, and expectations. If a bride cried, no one asked why. If she remained silent, they called it grace. If she trembled, they said it was natural. The island had built an entire language around silence. Later, that morning, the village women would gather at the well. They would talk, not loudly, but with knowing glances and small whispers. No one would name the bride's pain directly, but everyone would weave it into their quiet conversations, as if stitching another thread into a fabric they all shared. She looked pale, one might murmur. But that's how they all look the morning after, another would answer. And the cycle would continue. The bride was led outside just as the sun reached its first full light. Her feet touched the warm sand. She felt the air on her face, but it no longer felt like her island. Something had changed between her and this place. Yesterday, she had belonged to the island as a daughter. Today, she belonged to someone else. Her mother walked beside her, close but distant. Her eyes held something unspoken, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and resignation. She had once been a bride too. She had walked the same path on her own morning after. The people who saw the bride that morning did not see her fear. They saw only what tradition told them to see, a young woman beginning her married life as she was expected to. But the island saw more. It always did. It saw the stiffness in her hands as she walked. It felt the way her heartbeat trembled against the sand. It heard the soundless scream that lived behind her lowered eyes. When the women took her back to her new home, she did not resist. She simply walked, the way the tide goes where it must. And behind her, the sea whispered its old line. This is not the first time, and it will not be the last. By midday, the laughter of children returned to the shore. Men went fishing, women cooked. Life moved forward, because on this island, nothing stopped for a bride's heart. The morning after had its price, and the price was silence. The island was never truly quiet, even when the sea slept softly against the shore and the palms swayed as if half dreaming. There were always whispers. They floated like smoke between the huts, beneath the trees, across the narrow sandy paths. On the morning after a wedding, those whispers grew like vines. The bride was inside her new home, wrapped in silence. But outside, the island's people were already telling her story in pieces. Not loudly, never directly. In the Maldives of the Middle Ages, a bride's night belonged not only to her and her husband, but to the entire village. Her story became a whispered inheritance. At the village well, women gathered with their clay pots, their hands moving as naturally as their tongues. Water sloshed softly against the sides as they spoke, their voices just above the sound of the breeze. She did not step out early, one woman said softly, adjusting her scarf. Perhaps she was shy. Another replied, her voice thin as thread. Or perhaps, a third one added carefully, she was not ready for the night. No one said more than that. No one had to. On this island, silence spoke louder than any words. Across the path, a group of older men sat in the shade of a banyan tree. Their talk was rougher, less careful. Their laughter carried farther than the women's whispers. But even they, in their own way, kept to the boundaries of what could and could not be said. Another girl turned into a wife. One man chuckled. The night makes women quiet. Another answered. And then silence again, as if they too feared the weight of the night's truth. The groom was among them, sitting with a casual ease. Tradition placed no burden of silence on him. He was not expected to tremble or lower his eyes. His story would be told with pride, while hers would be told in murmurs. This was how it had always been. The bride's mother heard the whispers too. She walked past the well with her head slightly lowered, not out of shame, but because she understood. She had walked through this same tide of words years ago. Every woman on the island did. And so she didn't try to silence them. She simply let them flow around her like water, inevitable, unstoppable. Children ran barefoot through the sand, carrying no understanding of what the whispers meant. But one day, the little girls would learn as all the others had. One day, they would sit at that well, speaking in the same soft tones about another bride who came after them. The island thrived on these whispers. They were its secret language. What could not be spoken in the open, the pain, the fear, the small cruelties, was carried in these murmurs. They threaded through daily life like an invisible net, holding the community together in quiet complicity. In the afternoon, as the sun grew hot and the breeze slowed, the whispers reached the house where the bride sat alone. Not directly. No one would dare speak of the night to her face, but she could feel them pressing against the thin wooden walls like wind. She knew her story was being told outside, piece by piece. She didn't know the words, but she understood the weight of them. Her hands rested in her lap. She could still smell the oil in her hair, still hear the echo of the night's silence in her ears. She stared at the small window that looked out to the palms, where the world seemed unchanged. But she was not the same anymore. In this place, a bride learned quickly that what people didn't say was often louder than what they did. A soft voice came at the door. It was her aunt. She entered without knocking, as was custom, and placed a small bowl of sweetened water in front of her. A gesture of care, wrapped in silence.
They were not meant to comfort either. They simply were. A part of the island's breath, like the sea breeze and the sound of waves. They shaped how stories lived, how brides were remembered, how silence became a kind of language every woman understood. As the sun dipped lower, the island grew quieter. But the whispers never fully stopped. They shifted, softened, moved from the well to the kitchens, from the shade of the tree to the steps of houses. They grew smaller as night approached, but they never vanished. That night, the bride lay awake, listening to the distant sounds of the village, the creak of palm fronds, the occasional laughter, the call of a night bird. And beneath it all, like the faintest heartbeat, she heard it again. Whispers. always whispers. The island had no written stories, no books, no ink. Its history lived in these murmured words passed from ear to ear, generation to generation. And now, her name had quietly joined that invisible archive. It did not matter whether she spoke. Her story was already being told. The house was quiet again. The whispers outside had thinned into the soft sigh of night wind moving through the palms. Somewhere far off, the ocean was breathing in its long, slow rhythm. But inside the house, the bride's world was made of silence. She sat by the small window, knees drawn up, her fingers curled around the edge of her silk wrap. The oil lamp burned low, its flame bending softly with each passing breeze. Shadows moved across the wall like memories refusing to settle. In her chest, her heart spoke words her lips could not. This was the part no one ever told her about. Not her mother, not her aunties, not the older brides who whispered advice in the days before the ceremony. Everyone spoke of duty, of tradition, of what was expected. No one spoke of the silence afterward, the quiet ache of being trapped between who you were and who you must now become. In her heart, the night before replayed not as a story, but as a sensation, the weight of a door closing behind her, the press of expectation, the quiet heaviness of the air. She remembered the groom's expression, carefully arranged like a mask. She remembered the sound of her own breathing. There were no words for what it felt like to lose a part of yourself while no one seemed to notice. She looked outside at the dark palms, their silhouettes stretching upward like reaching hands. She had walked under those same trees as a child, chasing crabs, laughing with friends, feeling the sand between her toes. But the girl who ran beneath those palms was gone. In the Maldives of that time, a bride was expected to be quiet, always quiet. She was taught to lower her gaze, to fold her voice away like folded cloth. If she was frightened, she should not show it. If she was hurt, she should not speak of it. If she missed her home, she should bear it with grace. But the heart does not obey traditions. It whispered anyway. "I want to go home," it murmured. "I want to be free," it said softly. "I want someone to ask me how I feel." No one would ask, because in this place, a bride's feelings were like the wind, real but invisible. A single tear slid down her cheek, silent and almost shy, as though it too feared being noticed. It traced a path over her skin, glimmering in the lamplight. She didn't wipe it away. She let it fall, and it soaked into the silk around her. The walls of the house seemed to lean in, holding her in a stillness too heavy for her young heart. The faint sounds of the village had grown distant, like they belonged to another world, a world that no longer included her as she once was. She pressed her hand against her chest as if to quiet the heartbeat that felt too loud in the silence. But it kept whispering, "Still here, still yours, still beating." She thought of her mother, of the way her mother's eyes had looked that morning, proud, sad, knowing. She thought of the way older women avoided meeting her gaze. It was not cruelty. It was recognition. They too had held these same unspoken feelings once upon a time, but no one spoke them aloud. The island carried its stories through whispers. The brides carried theirs in silence. And so night after night, women like her learned to hide their hearts in small, secret corners. They tucked their dreams away like shells buried in the sand, unseen, but still there, waiting. She closed her eyes and imagined the sea. She imagined herself stepping into the water at dawn, letting the tide wash over her feet the way she had done on the last night before her wedding. That memory was the only piece of her old life she could still hold without permission. She imagined the tide carrying away her fear. But it was only a dream. The tide could carry sand, not sorrow. Somewhere outside, the groom's voice rose faintly in conversation with other men. Laughter followed, easy, careless. His world had not changed the way hers had. He could step outside. He could speak. He could be himself. She could not. She lowered her head and whispered something only the night could hear. Not words, but a soft breath, almost like a prayer. Let the sea remember me. The flame in the lamp trembled, as if the island itself was listening. She didn't know how long she sat there, minutes or hours. The darkness did not change, but her heart kept whispering its secrets. Words she would never tell anyone, words no one would ever hear. The island did not need her to speak. It already knew. And in the quiet of that night, her heart made a silent promise to itself that even if no one else could hear her story, she would remember it. Every breath, every wave, every whisper. Because silence can hide words, but it cannot erase them. The sun had not yet risen, but the island was already awake in its own quiet way. The ocean whispered softly to the shore. Palm fronds rustled like old women exchanging secrets. A thin silver light lay gently over the sand, fragile as breath. Inside the house, the bride sat with her hands folded in her lap. She had not slept. Sleep had no place in the space between yesterday and forever. Today she was no longer a girl, not because she felt different, but because everyone else would treat her as if she were. The moment the marriage took place, the island's law of unspoken rules wrapped around her like a net. And that net was called tradition. It was invisible, yet everyone could feel it. It had no voice, but it spoke louder than anyone. It had no face, yet it was the most powerful thing on the island. She had heard about it all her life, little pieces of it in lullabies, in evening talks, and how the elders spoke. A bride was not just a woman, she was a vessel of honor, family name, and obedience. She was expected to hold silence like a jewel, wear duty like a veil. And there was no space between these expectations for the girl she used to be. The first sign of these chains came that morning. When the aunties entered the house, they carried with them trays of scented water and cloth. Their faces were calm, practiced, their movements quiet and certain, the same way their mothers had done before them.
They did not ask her how she felt. They only told her what to do. Sit up straight. Do not look down too much, it shows weakness. Do not look up too much either, it shows pride. Walk softly. Speak even softer. You are a bride now. You must be perfect. Perfect. A word so heavy it pressed against her ribs like iron. As they brushed her hair and wrapped the fabric over her shoulders, she felt as if they were binding her to something she could not escape. Each layer of cloth, each stroke of the comb, was a thread and a web that had been spun long before she was born. She wanted to speak, to ask what would happen if she wasn't perfect, but the words never made it past her lips, because the truth was already written. Long before any bride opened her mouth, the island had decided her story. It was not hers to shape. It belonged to the weight of generations. Outside, the groom walked freely. He laughed with the men, stepped into the morning breeze, felt the salt air on his face. No one told him how soft to walk or how low to look. He belonged to the world. She belonged to the house. It was not cruelty. It was not kindness. It was tradition. A chain wrapped in flowers. And the cruelest thing about these chains was not their weight. It was how beautifully they were disguised. Girls were told it was an honor, a sacred duty, a blessing, but no one mentioned how it could also feel like a quiet prison. As she stepped outside, the women around her greeted her with smiles, but behind those smiles was understanding. Every bride knew this silence. Every bride had walked this same narrow path before her, and none of them had turned back. The path was lined with white shells, polished smooth by the hands of many brides before her. Each step she took was a step in their footsteps, as if the island itself guided her into the shape it wanted her to become. She paused for a moment, just a moment. A breeze moved through her hair. She felt a sharp ache deep inside her chest, the ache of knowing that the life she wanted might not be the life she would live. In the distance, the sea shimmered softly, a reminder that freedom existed somewhere out there, but not here. An older woman, the village matron, approached her slowly. She carried no flowers, no gifts, only a gaze that held the weight of years. She placed a hand on the bride's shoulder. "Daughter," she said, in a voice like cracked wood, "do not fight the tide. It will drown you. Learn to float." Her words were not meant to hurt. They were meant to prepare. But they still sank into the bride's heart like a stone, because floating was not the same as living. Floating was just a way of surviving. She nodded silently because that was all she could do. The matron smiled faintly, as if she saw herself reflected in those frightened eyes. The island did not need iron chains or locked doors. It used something stronger: expectation. Stories repeated so often they became truth. Rules so ancient, no one remembered who made them. The weight of tradition was not on her wrists or ankles, it was on her soul. And so she walked, down the sandy path, past the palms, into the role the island had written for her long ago. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this: her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to the whispers, to the eyes that watched, to the island, to tradition. The island looked peaceful from the outside. The palms swayed softly, the moon cast its silver skin on the water, and the ocean whispered like a gentle lullaby. But behind the quiet beauty of the Maldives in the Middle Ages, there was a truth that no one dared to speak too loudly. When night fell, the village changed. The whispers softened, the laughter faded, and in certain houses, behind closed doors and flickering oil lamps, a ritual began. Every bride knew about it. Every bride feared it. It was never called by its real name. The elders spoke of it as the union. The aunties whispered of it as the bridal duty. But in the dark, when no one could hear them, the brides had another name for it, a name they would never say out loud. The first night after the ceremony was not a night of celebration for her. It was a test of her silence, a test of her obedience, a test of whether she would disappear into the role expected of her. The ritual began with the closing of the door, a sound so soft, yet it carried the weight of centuries. Outside, the village slept. Inside, she was no longer a girl. She was a bride, and the island had decided what that meant. The groom was not expected to be gentle. He was not expected to ask. This was the night that belonged to him. The island's customs made it so. She sat on the thin mat laid carefully in the center of the room. Her hands trembled even as she forced them to be still. The air was thick with oil and incense, meant to make the room smell like celebration, but to her, it only smelled like fear. In the corner, the oil lamp burned low, throwing shifting shadows on the wall. Each shadow seemed to move closer to her. The sea's soft breathing outside made the silence even louder. No one ever prepared her for what would happen. They told her how to sit, how to lower her gaze, how to keep her voice inside her throat, but not what it would feel like to have no choice. When the groom entered, he carried no flowers, no tenderness, only the weight of what tradition had taught him, that the bride was his to claim, that this night was not a conversation, but a declaration. She kept her eyes lowered, because that's what they had told her to do. To look up was considered defiance. To speak was shameful. To resist, unthinkable. The island's law was not written on paper. It was written in how people lived, in what was expected of them. And this expectation, this ritual, was the heaviest of all. Her breath caught in her chest as the room seemed to shrink around her. The palms outside kept swaying, unaware. The ocean kept whispering, and in that small house, history repeated itself again, just as it had for generations. It was not about love. It was about control. The ritual was meant to remind her of her place, to mark the first night of her life not as a child of the island, but as someone's possession. And even though no one outside the walls would ever speak of it, everyone knew. The next morning, the whispers at the well, the glances from the aunties, the silence from her mother, they all carried the weight of what had happened behind that closed door. But no one would ask. No one ever did. Because asking would mean acknowledging the truth. She did not cry out. Not because she didn't want to, but because she had been taught not to. Silence was what the island expected of her, and silence was what it received. When it was over, the lamp flickered weakly, as if exhausted. The night outside moved on. The island continued to sleep. But inside, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, her body trembling as the world pretended nothing had changed. But everything had. That night was more than just a ritual. It was a moment in which a woman learned that her voice was not hers to use, that the island's beauty came with shadows so deep that they could not be spoken of in the daylight. And every bride after her would walk into that same darkness, just as every bride before her had. The ocean outside rose and fell. The waves did not care about human customs or cruel traditions, but they heard everything. They had always heard. The sea was the only witness that could not be silenced.
As the first light of dawn crept through the window, soft and shy, she turned her head toward it. Her face was calm. Too calm, because calmness was what the world expected. But inside her, a storm had begun to build. And that storm would stay there for a very long time. Quiet, unseen, waiting. The first light of dawn slipped quietly over the horizon, soft and gold, like it was trying not to wake the sea too quickly. Palm leaves shimmered in the early glow. The waves whispered the same song they had sung the night before. The island looked calm, beautiful, untouched. But inside the house, the world had changed. The bride sat on the floor, her knees drawn to her chest, her hair loose and tangled from the night. She did not move when the sun climbed higher. She just stared at the thin slit of light crawling across the wooden floor. It felt too bright,
too clean for what had happened in the darkness. Outside, the roosters called to the rising sun. Children ran past the house, laughing, as if joy had not been stolen from anyone. And slowly, as they always did, the villagers began to emerge into the morning. They pretended. Everyone pretended. The aunties came first, as tradition demanded. They brought small trays with sweet water and coconut, smiling gently, their movements smooth and practiced. They had all walked through the same doorway before. They knew what last night meant, but they did not ask. They only said, "You are a wife now. May your home be blessed. May you give many children." Each word floated in the air like a feather, light, delicate, and cruel. Because beneath the softness, they all knew the weight it carried. The groom walked outside with a proud ease. His laughter carried across the courtyard, unbothered, unburdened. Men greeted him like someone who had completed a sacred duty. He was no longer a young man. He was a husband, a position of honor. No one asked how the night went. They didn't need to. They already assumed. But for the bride, silence filled the air like thick smoke. Her mother entered last. She did not smile like the others. She looked at her daughter's face for a long time, a quiet, knowing gaze that said what words could not. She had seen that same look in the mirror years ago. She knelt beside her and gently smoothed the girl's hair away from her face. The bride wanted to say something, anything, but the words were stuck in the back of her throat, behind a wall of tradition that had been built long before her birth. "You must stand," her mother whispered softly. "The world will not stop for your pain." It was not cruelty. It was survival. Every woman before her had done the same thing, risen from the floor, washed her face, and stepped out into the light as if nothing had happened. Because on this island, pain was not a story to be told. It was a shadow to be carried. The bride let her mother pull her up. Her body felt heavy, as if her bones belonged to someone else. She washed her face with cold water from a clay bowl. The water bit into her skin. It woke her body, but not her soul. The aunties wrapped her in clean fabric, combed her hair, and placed flowers in it. To the outside world, she now looked exactly like a bride should on her first morning, calm, pure, silent. The silence was her mask. The flowers were her disguise. When she stepped outside, the village smiled at her. Children played in the sand, women carried water pots balanced gracefully on their hips. Men laughed near the banyan tree. Everything looked the same as yesterday. And that was the cruelest part, because everything had changed. Only no one would ever admit it. At the well, the women whispered again, just as they always did after a wedding night. Their voices were soft and slippery like water trickling down smooth stone. "She did not cry this morning. Then she is strong." Or maybe, one woman whispered lower, "She has already learned silence." They spoke as if she were not standing only a few feet away. Because, in a way, she wasn't. The girl who had walked freely under the palms was gone. A new version of her stood here now, quieter, smaller, hidden beneath layers of what was expected. The village moved around her as if she were part of the scenery. Not a person with a voice, but a symbol of what a bride should be, a vessel for future children, a keeper of the household, a shadow walking where a girl once danced. She walked to the shore. The tide was rising, curling softly at her feet. The sea, at least, it did not lie. It did not pretend not to see. It had been there last night. It had heard everything. For a brief moment, the breeze touched her face, and she felt something, small, fragile, but real. A piece of herself that had not yet been silenced. She held it tightly, deep inside, like a glowing ember hidden in the dark. Behind her, the aunties called her name. She turned, smiled the smile they expected. The mask was complete, and the island exhaled. Another ritual completed. Another bride folded into silence. But the sea never forgot. It carried every unspoken story in its endless waves. Seasons passed softly on the island. The palms grew new leaves, The sea changed colors with the wind, and the same tides rose and fell each day as they always had. Life moved forward. But for the bride, time began to feel like a quiet circle, spinning endlessly around her. The night of her wedding became a shadow, stitched into every sunrise. It did not speak anymore, but it was always there. On the outside, she became exactly what the island wanted her to be: a wife, a woman who spoke gently, moved slowly, never raised her voice. People nodded approvingly when they saw her. She has settled well, they would say at the well, as if silence meant happiness. But inside her chest, she carried a small, hidden storm. In those years, tradition wrapped tighter around her like a net. It was not made of rope or iron. It was made of expectations, soft, invisible, unbreakable. She rose before the sun to prepare water. She served the elders without question. She walked with her eyes lowered. Every movement was a ritual. Every word measured. Every breath contained. The women of the island had learned this long ago. The best way to survive was to disappear without vanishing, to let the world see the shape of a woman, but not the fire within her. That fire was dangerous. It was never allowed to burn too bright. She learned to smile without meaning it, to laugh softly when others expected it, to bow her head when her husband spoke, even when her heart wanted to scream. She became fluent in silence. And the years, they blurred. Her hands grew stronger from daily chores. Her feet knew every grain of sand on the path from the house to the well. Her face became familiar to the village, another bride, another wife, another silent woman among many. But sometimes, at night, when the village fell asleep, she would walk down to the sea alone.
The moon would float above the water like a lantern, silver and still. The tide would whisper softly at her ankles, and there, in the quiet darkness, she could breathe like herself again, even if only for a few moments. "Do you remember me?" she would whisper to the sea. "The girl who ran barefoot under the palms." The sea always answered in its own way, with a sighing wave or a rush of water over the sand. It was the only thing that had known her before she became a bride, the only thing that didn't ask her to pretend. But even the sea could not free her. On the island, women like her rarely spoke of what they felt, but they understood each other in the way their eyes lingered, in the slight tightening of their hands, in the way they shared silence instead of words. Some had learned to bury their fire so deeply that they no longer felt it. Others, like her, kept it alive in the smallest corners of their soul. As the years went on, the rituals repeated. Ceremonies for other brides came and went. Young girls she once knew became women, walking the same path she had. She watched them lower their eyes, smile when expected, disappear into the roles the island had prepared for them. And she saw something in their faces she recognized: fear. The same fear that once lived in her eyes. But no one ever said it aloud, not the aunties, not the mothers, not the brides themselves. The silence was too heavy, too old, too accepted. Her husband changed with time, too. He grew older, broader, louder in the way men on the island were allowed to. He never asked her what she thought, and she never told him. They lived like two shadows tied together, walking side by side but never truly touching souls. Some nights he was kind, other nights he was distant, but in every moment the island's laws stood between them like a wall she could not cross. Children came as they were expected to. Her body belonged to duty, her voice to silence, but her heart, what was left of it, belonged to the sea. The villagers praised her often. She is a good wife. She does not complain. She accepts her place. And she would smile, the kind of smile that lives only on the lips and not in the eyes. The world saw perfection. No one saw the quiet cracks beneath.
Years became layers of silence, like shells stacked on the shore, each one holding an echo of something lost. And though the storm inside her never truly died, it learned to be quiet, to wait, to survive. Some nights when the wind blew harder and the waves roared against the rocks, she felt the storm stir. She would stand at the edge of the water, letting the salt cling to her skin, and she would imagine, just for a breath, what it might feel like to be free. Not as a wife, not as a bride, but as herself. The tide would pull at her ankles like hands urging her forward. But she never stepped in, not fully, because she knew what awaited her in the house. She knew the world she lived in was not one that allowed women to run toward the horizon. And so she turned back. Every time. The island had claimed her. And it was not done yet. The moon hung heavy above the island that night, casting silver light across the shore. The tide rose and fell like a breathing creature, pulling secrets from the sand and whispering them back into the dark. The bride, no longer a girl, but not yet an old woman, walked alone along the beach. Her bare feet sank into the cool, wet sand, and the sea greeted her the way it always had. It was the only thing that had never turned its back on her. Years had shaped her. Tradition had carved her into someone the island approved of. But beneath her skin, beneath the rituals, beneath the silence, she still carried a memory, a single night, a beginning she never chose. She stopped where the water met the shore, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't look back toward the house. She didn't think of the husband, or the ceremonies, or the laws older than her name. She only thought of the tide, and of the girl she once was. The island's customs had tried to bury that girl, but she had lived on, quietly, like a spark hidden under ashes. "Do you still know me?" she whispered to the sea. And the sea answered with a long, low sigh that swept around her ankles and climbed higher with the wind. It was as if the water remembered everything the world wanted her to forget. She remembered her first night as a bride, the fear, the ritual, the silence that wrapped itself around her like a second skin. But what the island never understood was this: silence is not the same as forgetting. Generations of brides had walked the same path. Their names were lost to time, their stories drowned beneath centuries of obedience, but their echoes remained in the tide, in the way the wind carried a certain weight at night, in the way the sea wept softly when the world slept. The island had always belonged to its laws, but the ocean belonged to no one. And so the sea had kept their stories safe. Every whisper, every sigh, every tear swallowed quietly in the dark. "We were here," the tide seemed to say. "We remember." The woman closed her eyes and let the water touch her knees. It felt cold, alive. It felt like freedom, the kind she had only imagined in the dark corners of her soul. And in that moment, she didn't feel like a bride. She didn't feel like someone's wife. She felt like herself again. The girl who once ran barefoot through the palms. The girl who once believed the world was bigger than this island. The world had changed beyond the shores. Empires rose and fell. Sailors crossed seas. New names were written into the maps. But here, on this small island in the Maldives, some traditions held on with quiet, relentless hands. Some would call it culture. Others would call it cruelty. But for the brides who lived it, it was a weight that never left their skin. She tilted her face to the moonlight, and for the first time in years, she let her tears fall. Not out of fear, not out of defeat, but because she understood something now. The story wasn't hers alone.
It belonged to every woman who had stood on this same shore, every bride who had been silenced, every girl who had been turned into a role, every soul who had whispered to the sea and waited for an answer. The island's people had never written their names in books, but the ocean had written them in waves, and waves do not forget. The woman stood in the water until the tide touched her waist. She did not walk further. She didn't need to. The sea was not an escape. It was a witness. And sometimes being seen is enough. Behind her, the village slept in its circle of rules. Ahead of her, the horizon stretched endless and dark. Between those two worlds, she stood, silent, breathing, alive. For centuries after her, the tides kept whispering. New brides came, new nights unfolded in quiet terror. And though the customs shifted with time, though the world slowly crept in with its modern ways, the old stories did not vanish. They echoed beneath the surface of the sea, like a heartbeat beneath still water. Some were broken, some learned to speak, some carried the silence until it became part of them, but all of them left their echoes behind. And so, if one were to walk the beach of that island on a still night, if one were to listen closely, beyond the rustle of the palms, beyond the sighing of the waves, one might hear them. A chorus of whispers, a sea of untold stories, the soft, quiet voices of Maldives brides long gone. We were here, the tide would say again. We remember. The woman, that nameless bride whose story began with a night of fear, returned to the shore and stood at the edge of the sand. She took a deep breath, one that felt bigger than her body, deeper than the island. A breath that belonged to her alone. She would return to the village when the night grew old. She would live out the life expected of her. But something had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt full of names, of memories, of a truth too long buried. The world might never tell their stories, but she knew now the sea would. And so, under the silver moon and the endless night sky, she whispered back, I remember too. And the tide, faithful and eternal, carried her voice into the dark.